Hi guys, it's Pete from MyJewelryBench.com. This is part 2 of a 3-part series about the Chinese DG3804 GMT movement. It's a very inexpensive GMT movement from China, and I want to just follow up with you in this part 2, and talk about what I've experienced over the last 4 weeks with this particular watch. If you remember correctly, I'll put a link to it. I assembled this watch from parts I got on eBay. I bought everything on eBay and assembled this watch myself. I'm not happy with a couple of things. The watch is losing about 15 minutes a day after 4 weeks. And I really did a crappy job on the dial, so we're going to redo a new dial, and I am going to completely disassemble and service the movement, and we're going to see if we can get this watch to run much better. Let's get started. So before I get started, guys, I just want to go through and tell you what I'm going to do in this video. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cover all the tools that you're going to need to perform this particular function, which is disassembling and servicing the entire watch. And I will go through each of those tools. And then I'm just going to record the disassembly and service, reassembly, and we will talk about it in a voiceover. Okay, so before we tear down this watch, let's go over the tools that you're going to need. You're going to need several tools: screwdrivers and tweezers for one. You're also going to need a parts tray and a movement holder. I also recommend a good watch pad. You'll need hand removers, a hand blower, microfiber cloths to dry your parts out with, and you're also going to need an ultrasonic cleaner with some good watch cleaning solution. You'll need several bowls, one for hot water and one with watch rinse. And when you take your parts out of the ultrasonic cleaner, you want to rinse them off in hot water, then the rinse solution, and then you can dry those off. And you'll need a case opener depending on which case type you have, so make sure you have that handy. In this case, I used a standard Rolex case, 29.5 millimeter case back opener, and that worked well for me. And if you haven't seen my video on cleaning watch parts, I'll put a link to it in the upper right corner. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to start doing is removing the winding weight, and that's just held in by one screw. You can see this is just a standard blued screw. It seems to be what comes on a lot of Chinese watch movements. I apologize for the focus of the camera. My thumb kept getting in the way of the focusing and kind of made a little problem with the focus. Here I'm just taking out the screws. There's 2 screws and 2 case holders. So you want to get those out and be careful with those, not to let them fall into the movement. I'm just going to pull in the stem release here, push it down, pull out the stem and the crown. And now I can just pull the movement out. The first thing I always like to do, though, since I'm working, when I'm reassembling these, I always take the gaskets out. Just to force a habit for me, you don't have to. And the movement should just pop out right now. The next thing you want to do is get the hands off, and I'm going to use my hand remover tool here. It's just one tool, pop all the hands off. I'm not interested in saving this dial since I screwed it up like I said before, so we're going to replace the dial with a new one. 2 screws on the DG3804 hold the dial together with the movement, so you're just going to loosen those up, pull that dial off. And now I'll just take out the GMT gear, and we'll move on to the balance. Now this is not like an ETA or a Rolex movement. You got to be very careful with this balance. The hairspring is a little softer than on a Rolex, similar to that of an ETA, so just lift it out carefully without doing any damage. Once you get it away from the movement, it should just lift right up. And we'll grab the pallet fork and get that out. There's 2 screws that hold the bridge in place for the pallet fork, so you gotta just take those out. Now this watch does not have an accessible spring release on it, so you should let it just wind down. Here I'm going to remove 3 screws from the plate that holds all the setting gears down. Now this might look a little intimidating. Once we get under here, you're going to see there's quite a few gears. But just 3 little screws hold this down, and the plate does a really good job. I will give it that much. So you can see all the setting gears. First thing I'm going to do is take out the, the date ring and that little click spring for the date click The date ring click, that is not held in very well. I'm going to take out all of these little gears and I'm going to put those in a very similar area laid out like they are on the watch. And I would recommend that, or take lots of photos so that you remember where each of these setting gears goes. And I'll pull out the cannon pinion. This cannon pinion was also a little bit loose. I'll deal with that later when I put it back together. So here you can see I'm pointing out there was a ton of yellow oil that had already dried up inside the watch. So I was kind of glad I was going to be tearing it down and doing a service. There are 5 screws that hold the bottom plate onto the frame. This, in my opinion, is difficult for servicing because this one plate holds all the gears together simultaneously, and it'll be a nightmare to put back together. So I'm just going to examine that real quick, make sure there's nothing wrong, and then I will take all of these winding and running gears, the train out, one gear at a time, put those aside, and be very gentle with these. That's the hack. And now I'll take out the clutch gears here. And you can see there's some oil still left on there. Now it's time to get the center wheel out. 2 screws hold that bridge plate in place. So we're going to take those out, put that aside, and the center wheel comes right out. This is as much of a teardown as I'm going to do on this particular frame. The next thing I'm going to do is examine the mainspring and find out if that was why I was having a problem with this watch. So you can see the winding gear for the mainspring, and then I pull out the cover, and here's the mainspring itself. Of course, this watch is only I've only had it for about 4 weeks. So what I was really surprised to see is that there is absolutely no oil on this mainspring, and I always put a little mainspring oil on any new mainspring I use after I've cleaned them, because I just want to make sure that they're going to have enough tension here. So here you can see how I've laid out all my parts prior to cleaning. So this is the step at which you would get all these into parts baskets in an order or a manner that you're comfortable with, and then clean each and every part. Be very careful with some of these parts because they are a little bit more delicate than I typically see. But I've laid them all out here. Now, after I've oiled the mainspring with some spring oil, I'm just going to snap it back together and get this ready to go back into the watch. We'll put it aside for now until I'm going to do the assembly. Now here's the frame of the watch, and I'm going to start with the train. So first thing I'm going to do is put the center wheel back on. Of course, all my parts are cleaned and ready to go. And I always test everything, make sure that everything spins freely and that we're not binding up anywhere. And then I will gently screw in all of these little parts together one by one. I will say parts of this watch are very, very well made. Other parts of this watch I have to really be honest and say that there is some sloppiness in the movement, and that disturbs me a little bit. And here you can see I'm assembling the clutch system, and I like to put the stem back in the watch as I'm assembling it so that I can turn the train and see if there's movement, especially free movement, while I'm working on it. Yeah, I'm going to snap that into place. There it goes. And now I can just do a test and make sure the clutch system works and that I'm ready to attach everything else. So here's the hack. This hack does not, it doesn't interact with the balance wheel like on a Rolex or an ETA or a Valjoule. This interacts with actually stopping the train itself. So it has a little gear there, a little arm that will actually stop one of the gears to activate the stopping hack. So here's where I started running into some issues. Is these gears, the escape was fine. I had no problem with that. But to assemble this watch, here's the click for the mainspring, and you can see the click spring. I'm going to just shove that little click under the mainspring, or under the spring itself, so that it stays in that position while I do the assembly. Otherwise, you can't assemble the winding gears to this, so keep that in mind. And now I'll just put the rest of the train in. I would say fit on most of these gears was not good. I won't say poor, but I would say it could be a whole lot better. I like to see the pinions of each gear fit into the jewels and not necessarily just stay there, but a fitment tight enough where they're held in place while you're putting the bridge together. So here's the main winding gear for the mainspring. Here's the weighted auto winder gear, and this gave me a little issue trying to get in, especially because I have, what, 6 gears to get in here, 7 gears. And there's a spring underneath this plate that holds the pinion in for the second hand. So what I do in a case like that, when I'm working with a watch train, I will try to get this in place and put one screw in position at the, let's say, the first end of the train that I'm going to work on. And I'm going to work on this from left to right, or from this point from bottom to top. And I'm going to get this little screw in place, and I'm only going to turn it about 1/4 of the way so that it's holding the bridge onto the frame of the watch, but not putting any pressure on any of the pinions and the gears. And now I can use a fine pair of tweezers and kind of work my way, starting with the escape wheel, and try to make sure that it gets into the jewel movement, get those pinions into the jewels without doing any damage. And you're going to want to be very careful here. I don't know the quality of these jewels and how much abuse they can take, so I'm assuming that if I touch them the wrong way, they're just going to break. And you can't really get parts for these, but the movement's cheap enough just to buy a new one. So I try to get this under a microscope, and I'm going to basically start at the escape wheel and work my way around, holding the bridge and the frame together as I get each gear's pinion into the corresponding ruby jewels. And that way I know that the train is going to be set well, if that makes any sense. And my microscope camera, I couldn't get it to really look through the microscope and record at the same time, so I apologize for that, but I'm trying to get a shot of just, working with the gears here while I'm trying to just set them into the each pinion into the jeweled plate. This took me roughly 40 minutes to get this seated well with it, and I was just putting almost no pressure on this, just trying to get it to fall together. It did take some work, so keep that in mind if you're going to tear this down and do a service. The assembly time of this watch, I think I was in hour 3 at this point, after tearing it down and cleaning it and trying to reassemble. So now I've got the watch together. The train is good. I've tested it with the stem, and here I'm just going to put the screws back into the plate so that the watch is held together. So while I'm putting the screws into the plate and to hold everything together, I'm actually testing this a little bit just to make sure that everything spins correctly, just making sure that I've got the train working. There's no friction on this movement, so every time I turn that crown, the train should move freely. And it's a good time to check your mainspring gear click, make sure everything's fine and released before you tighten everything together. Remember, I lifted the click spring for the mainspring winder, and now you can see everything's fine. I just turned a little bit and that watch moves pretty freely. And that's what I was looking for. So now when you're working on a watch, you can listen to it and it'll tell you if it has a little friction. I have not yet oiled it, so now is the time to put some oil at each of the jeweled points. And I'm just using some standard ETA watch oil. I will oil every jeweled location. This is a very thin oil. It works really good. I've never had issues with it. And as long as the movement stays clean, I've had watches last 6, 7, 8 years. And then when you test the movement again, it should sound a whole lot better. Even if it didn't have friction before, there should be a whole lot less friction on it. And now that everything I know is working and oiled, it's time to tackle the pallet fork. I'm going to start by putting a little oil on the lower balance jewel and the pallet jewel and get this set. This is a very delicate piece of the watch. I always tell people the hairspring and the pallet fork balance staffs, they're very delicate pieces, so be very careful, especially when you're putting this piece in. The pinion on this gear, the pinion on the pallet fork will break real easy on almost any watch if you're not careful. Again, what I do is I place the bridge in its proper setting. I'll put the screw in. I'll tighten it down about maybe 1/3 of the way so everything's being held together, and then I'll just play with the pallet fork just to make sure that everything's in place. And once I know it's seated correctly and that we're not going to have any issues, I'll put the second screw in and then tighten everything down. Now, I'm not oiling that, I'm just making sure it's spinning, and it is, and it's got a good click to it, which is what I want to see. Once that's happening, I can put the balance assembly back in place. Again, you want to be very careful. It's a very delicate hairspring. I'd say this is more like a lady's watch hairspring than it is a men's watch, but it does its job. And once you get that seated, if you've got the balance wheel in its proper position, once you get the balance cock set onto the frame, you should see the balance wheel just take off. Just like so. Now I can put the balance screw or the balance cock screw back in, and then I know this watch is going to be working. Again, when I'm tightening this screw down, I'm very careful. I don't put a lot of pressure on it. I turn it, when I get to the finishing point, I just turn it a little bit just to make sure that everything's working. If the watch stops, I'll check and see if there's friction. I don't screw it down too tight because I don't want to break the balance staff. Once I'm comfortable that it's working right, I can go back and finish tightening up the balance cock screw, and I know that balance cock's not going to go anywhere. I'll give it a little bit of wind and just make sure that the winding works good, the watch is running good. And this is a good time to put it on a timer and test the timing, because I can make any adjustments to the watch now. This watch, I did time it, and it does time pretty well. I got this a little bit better. I got this down to about 2 seconds per day. I think with the looseness of the train, the fact that the manufacturing is a little off on some of these parts, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get it any better. And I don't know its long-term reliability, since I've only been using this watch for 4 weeks and had a 15-minute error per day. That kind of shocked me, but that happened for 2 reasons. So here now I'm just going to put a little dab of oil on each of the posts for the setting gears. And that's something I like to do just to make sure they move smoothly. Sometimes you can get some friction on those. They don't move fast, they don't move rapid, and they only move when you're setting the watch. But for the most part, you want them to move as freely as possible. Now this gear here, that's for the automatic date change, and then this is the setting gear. This is the first of 3 setting gears for the time. Now you see this little brass ring. That brass ring goes on the first setting gear as a spacer, and that's to make sure that that gear doesn't slip up or down and miss a tooth on any of the other setting gears. Here's the click for the date ring, and the click actually fits perfect. I think that was machined excellently. Unfortunately, the frame that holds the click spring for that was really poor. Now here's where I had another issue. If you notice, that cannon pinion went on really easy, and it was loose. And I ended up taking it off and tightening it up a little bit just to make sure that it would work well. And I'm thinking that was part of my problem with the watch losing time, because that cannon pinion was so loose to begin with. Intermediate gear for the automatic date change. And then here's that click spring, and this took me 15 minutes to get it seated. And unfortunately the frame, unlike an ETA movement or a Rolex or any of the higher end watches, Val Jewel, this frame is rounded over and the click spring didn't want to stay in position. So I think as far as manufacturing the area where that click spring falls into, I got to give that one a 0 out of 10, because that one just gave me, that was a nightmare to get in there. And like I said, I struggled with it for a long time, and that should have gone in pretty simple. Once I got that all done, and it was time to get the date ring back in place, I think it might show up here. I tried to slip the date ring in place and that click spring popped out again, so there's another 15 minutes back to the drawing board. Yeah, and there it goes. You can see it stuck on the side of the top of the movement. I think I said a few choice curse words and then went back and put that spring back in place. Once I got everything to stick, then it's time to put the plate back on top of the setting gears. And again, there's 3 screws that hold this down. And this plate fits wonderfully. I was very happy with fitment on this. Now typically what I'll do is I'll tighten the screws almost not quite tight, and then I'll test it, make sure everything is working. When everything's working good, then I can go back and tighten up all the screws and make sure that they're all seated correctly. If anything's going to happen to the setting system, that's the time to do it. And now is the best time, after you've got it all assembled, wind it, set the date, run through the hours, and make sure that it's going to set the time or set the date ring automatically when we hit midnight. And everything worked perfectly. I was very happy with that. Do the final assembly. This is the GMT wheel, and that goes in good. It's a little bit on the loose side. That sloppiness kind of bums me out because the GMT hand can hit an indicator on the dial, so you're going to have to be a little conscious of your hand level. Obviously we want to go all the way around the dial, and we want to clear the hands also, so just keep an eye on the levels of each hand when you're assembling this watch. Using my handy dandy hand push tool just to put these hands back in position. I typically will put every hand on and then test it against the lower hand to make sure that it's not rubbing against anything, and I do this continuously as I put each hand on. So I'll put a hand on, then I'll test it, I'll make adjustments, then I'll go to the next hand. And finally the second hand. It did not give me as much trouble, although I've got a new dial and a new set of hands here. These hands fit perfectly. They didn't give me any issues. I did have to make a little adjustment to the second hand because it was going to rub up against the minute hand, but that's pretty common first time you assemble a new watch. You know, blow off all the dust, make sure it's dust free, and I'll clean the case one more time before I put this back in. So now that I know this watch is serviced, I got the new hands on, the new dial, everything works, everything's oiled to the way I would do it. It's time to do the final assembly and just throw this in the case. And I'll put a link up in the upper right corner so that you can see my video on when I originally built this watch. You can go back and watch that video for the assembly. So I'm just going to fast forward through this and we'll get to my thoughts. So after spending about 6 hours total tearing this down, servicing it, putting it back together, I would say that on a scale of 1 to 10, this is probably a 5 or a 6 as far as ease of getting it back together. Quality-wise, I'd say it's a 7. The parts could be manufactured a little bit better, and I would like to see that. And I did find a couple issues with this that that kind of disturbed me while I was putting it back together, but nothing I couldn't work with or fix. So I want to apologize for that long, arduous, terrible assembly procedure. While these watches do come apart easy, they are a nightmare to put back together, and I hope you just watched that. And I tried to explain as much as I could. I think with the fact that it's fully serviced now, and the fact that the mainspring had absolutely no oil on it, we should be okay once we get this thing running. But I'm going to give it about 3 weeks, and I'm going to give you my final review of this watch movement, the DG3804, and I'm going to let you know if this GMT movement is actually as good as I was hoping for. I'm still fond of the ETA movements, so those are still my favorite. But I just wanted to see if these cheap things were a viable alternative. I would assume when you buy these complete knockoff watches online, if I opened up every one and found the globs of oil that I saw, and the fact that the mainsprings had no lubrication in them, and they were just kind of a little disaster on the inside, I would assume that you'd probably get about 4 to 5 months out of a watch like this before it really started slowing down to the point where maybe it was only running about 10 or 12 hours a day. That's my experience with this watch. I mean, it did, after 3 weeks, it's kind of disappointed me a little bit in the fact that it's 15 to 20 minutes a day slow. It does run when I wear it, but it does not keep a full whine like it did the first week, which it would run about 48 hours the first week I had it. So I'm going to let you know in a couple of weeks what I find with this, and I hope you enjoyed this full service of the DG3804, and if you did, give it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, please consider subscribing to my channel. It does help my channel grow. And if you want to share this with anybody you know, please go ahead and hit the share button. Thanks, and have a great day, guys.